Hello, gentle viewers. Welcome to a video, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at some lesser-known landmark lesbian films and discussing their impact and influence on lesbian cinema as a whole. That's right, buckle up. Oftentimes, when the topic of landmark lesbian films comes up, I've noticed that productions such as Mayshun in Uniform, Desert Hearts, The Watermelon Woman, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire, just to name a few of the usual suspects, are the primary focus, with certain other landmark lesbian films rarely being mentioned or ignored altogether, despite being just as significant in terms of their contributions to lesbian cinema. So, with this video, I wanted to bring these lesser-known lesbian films to the forefront, and if you have an interest in lesbian cinema or lesbian history, I think these following productions are important to know about. And with that said, follow me as we step into the magical world of lesser-known landmark lesbian films. So the first film on the list is the 1979 Dutch film A Woman Like Eve, directed by Noeske van Brakel and starring Maria Schneider and Monique van der Van. A Woman Like Eve tells the story of a married woman named Eva, who leaves her husband and their two young children after meeting and falling in love with Liliane, a free-spirited young bohemian living in a rural commune. Following their affair, Eva battles both to gain custody of her children and against the social stigma she encounters for rejecting a traditional heteronormative lifestyle in order to follow her heart's desire. So this film is a landmark in lesbian cinema because it's one of the first films to openly depict both same-sex couple parenting in a positive light and lesbian discrimination in a custody battle, which was groundbreaking for the time. A Woman Like Eve is also significant because it was made by a production crew of primarily women, and it is a uniquely and unapologetically feminist piece of work that depicts women, the female body, and lesbian identity and intimacy through the female gaze, which challenged and stood out against the sea of hypersexualization and exploitation of women and lesbianism in the male-dominated film industry of the 70s. Yeah, lesbian vampire sexploitation films, we're looking at you, punk. Furthermore, interestingly, the lesbian love scene in this film contains a lot of visual parallels to one of the Bette and Tina love scenes in season 1 of The L Word. And given Eileen Shaken's comments about the influences of lesbian cinema on the show, and the fact that the cast were given lesbian films to watch and study, there's a strong possibility that A Woman Like Eve was one of the inspirations for that scene. The next film on the list is the 1974 French-Belgian film Je tu Hillel, directed by and starring Chantal Akerman. Je tu Hillel is about a young woman who, following a lengthy self-imposed exile, ventures out into the world where she has two very different experiences of intimacy and connection. Now, this film is often labelled as a lesbian film. However, Chantal Akerman actually rejected any labels being placed on her work and intended Je tu Hillel to be seen as a portrayal of human connection and desire, which in truth is a more accurate description than lesbian film. However, due to the film's groundbreaking sapphic elements and its artistic influence, its significance to lesbian cinema cannot be understated. So this film is a landmark in lesbian cinema because it not only contains the first graphic lesbian love scene to be shown in mainstream cinema, but also one of the longest lesbian love scenes in film too. That's quite the brag. Je tu Hillel, through its cinematography and artistic choices, also contains a lot of commentary about the consumption of female bodies and lesbianism in film. And its lesbian love scene is unique in that it doesn't cater to the viewer and is not about audience gratification, which, similar to A Woman Like Eve, challenged the exploitation of lesbianism and the female body that was prevalent in the male-dominated film industry during that period, and also made Je tu Hillel one of the precious few sources of authentic representation for sapphic women at that time too. Furthermore, Celine Sciamma has spoken about the impact and influence that Akerman's work has had on her own, and there are some striking similarities between Je tu Hillel and Sciamma's film Portrait of a Lady on Fire, with both productions creating space for viewer introspection, commentary through cinematography, and being radically feminist works which capture the female gaze in a unique way. So it's interesting interesting to know that Ackerman's work influenced what is often considered to be one of the greatest lesbian films of all time, and because of all of this, in some ways, Portrait of a Lady on Fire can be viewed as a homage to Ackerman as an artist, which adds yet another meaningful layer to the film. The next film is the 1974 film Dyke Tactics, directed by Barbara Hammer. Dyke Tactics is a 4-minute experimental film which celebrates lesbian sensuality and sexuality using 110 images of sensual touching montages in ABCD roles of kinesthetic editing. Yeah, I totally know what kinesthetic means. Google. This film is a landmark in lesbian cinema because it was one of the first lesbian films to explicitly depict lesbian identity, desire, and sexuality made by an openly, which is the key word here, lesbian American filmmaker. And because of this, Barbara Hammer is considered an important pioneer for independent lesbian filmmaking. Dyke Tactics is also groundbreaking for the way it presents lesbian sexuality on screen. The film is incredibly explicit and erotic, yet Hammer's direction and cinematography doesn't disconnect women from their bodies or hypersexualize them. And furthermore, there's a sense of joy, safety, and connection in her depiction of lesbian intimacy, which makes Dyke Tactics a unique and positive source of lesbian representation. Hammer has said about the film, "I think I was most interested in the performance of the body, the performance of women being active subjects on the screen where they could not be watched voyeuristically because they were so active." And this reveals what she was trying to do with this film, and again, like A Woman Like Eve and Jetu Hillel, this is another piece of cinema which challenged the way women and lesbianism were distorted, exploited, and consumed through the male gaze in 70s media. The next film is the 1994 independent drama film Go Fish, directed by Rose Trochet and starring Guinevere Turner and T. Wendy McMillan. Now, granted, Go Fish is not as sidelined in discussions about landmark lesbian cinema as some of the other productions on this list. However, I don't see its influence and impact discussed or acknowledged nearly as much as it should be, considering just how much it changed and shaped the trajectory of lesbian cinema. Go Fish tells the story of the interrelationships of a small group of lesbian friends in Chicago, and the narrative is broken up by a number of discussions on lesbian issues, dream sequences, commentary that breaks the fourth wall, and moments of free verse poetry. Now, the reason Go Fish is a landmark lesbian film is because it was not only the first lesbian feature film to screen in competition at the Sundance Film Festival, but it was also the first lesbian film to secure a distribution deal at the festival. And this was significant because it proved the marketability of lesbian stories to the film industry, which resulted in Hollywood taking a chance on lesbian filmmakers looking to make work with explicitly lesbian themes. This is the film that opened up the door for films such as Saving Face, The Incredibly True Adventures of Two Girls in Love, and But I'm a Cheerleader. Go Fish was also the first widely released lesbian film that portrayed the everyday lives of a diverse and politically engaged lesbian friend group. And the film not only offered a unique and authentic exploration of lesbian experience and identity, but it also opened up dialogue and conversation about lesbian issues from different perspectives, all of which was completely radical for the time. Furthermore, the director, Rose Trochet, went on to work on The L Word, which created several connections and parallels between Go Fish and The L Word, including Guinevere Turner's recurring appearance on the show. "Oh, Gabby, you're so fine, you blow my mind. Hey, Gabby. Hey, Gabby." I mean, The L Word is basically just Go Fish on, like, glamorous steroids. Is it not? The next film is the 1961 film The Children's Hour, directed by William Wyler and starring Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine. The Children's Hour is a remake of the 1936 film These Three, also directed by William Wyler, and both films are based on Lillian Hellman's 1934 Broadway hit The Children's Hour, about a true-life 1809 case of two women running a girls' school whose lives were ruined after a student accused them of being lesbians. Now, due to after the strict enforcement of the Hays Code in 1936, the lesbian element from Hellman's play was removed for these three, and the narrative was rewritten to revolve around a love triangle between two women and a man. In 1961, however, the Hays Code was much less stringently enforced due to a decline in legal support, and that, combined with a changing socio-political climate in the US, meant that Wyler could direct a new version of Hellman's play that retained the original subject matter of lesbianism, and thus The Children's Hour was born. The Children's Hour is a landmark in lesbian cinema because it was one of the first mainstream Hollywood films to make lesbianism a central part of its narrative, and that, combined with the film featuring popular stars such as Audrey Hepburn, meant that the topic of homosexuality was brought to a wider audience. And this was important because The Children's Hour explored the subject of homosexuality through a compassionate lens, with it framing hate and judgment stemming from homophobia in a harmful light, and framing the lesbian character Martha on the receiving end of the homophobia in a sympathetic light. And the messaging of the film encouraged audiences to examine their prejudices and consider the damage it causes, which was incredibly bold in a time where the social and political climate towards gay and lesbian populations was still deeply hostile. Now, it's true the film does fuel the reductive association between lesbianism and tragedy with Martha's suicide, but it's also worth considering that Martha's death was framed as a result of a homophobic society and worked to maximize the audience's sympathy for a homosexual character, which helped to impress the message of the film rather than as a punishment for her homosexuality. And the fact that Karen doesn't end up in a happily ever after with Joe after losing Martha and instead walks away by herself makes the ending of the film progressive in the sense that it went against heteronormative expectations in cinema at the time. In a lot of ways, this film signifies the end of the Hays Code's reign of cinematic terror against homosexuals, and that, alongside everything else we've discussed, is what makes The Children's Hour a significant landmark in lesbian cinema. The next film on the list is the 2011 film Pariah, directed by Dee Rees and starring Adepero Aduye and Kim Wayans. Pariah is about a 17-year-old black lesbian learning to navigate and embrace her identity. Now, this film is a landmark in lesbian cinema because it is the first movie about a black lesbian to be released in theatres nationwide by a Hollywood studio. And furthermore, Dee Rees is both the first black woman and the first black lesbian woman to have a film in the Criterion Collection with Pariah. So, Pariah represents a significant turning point for black lesbian on-screen representation by being the first black lesbian film to have the support of a Hollywood studio, which allowed for it to be brought into the mainstream and acknowledged in a way we haven't seen with black lesbian cinema previously. And all of this is what makes Pariah a significant and important landmark in lesbian cinema. The last film on the list is the 2022 film Blue Jean, directed by Georgia Oakley and starring Rosie McEwen and Kerry Hayes. Blue Jean is set in England 1988, when Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government is about to pass a law stigmatising gays and lesbians, forcing Jean, a gym teacher, to live a double life. Jean has always kept her sexuality hidden from her co-workers, but that veil of self-protection comes under threat when she spots one of her new students, Lois, at the local lesbian bar she frequents with her girlfriend Viv. Now, for those who don't know, Section 28 was a legislative designation for a series of laws across Britain that prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, particularly in schools, and it was in effect from 1988 to the early 2000s. So, Blue Jean is a landmark in lesbian cinema because it is the first feature film to specifically focus on the impact of Section 28 through its depiction of a lesbian teacher in late 1980s Newcastle navigating the oppressive atmosphere created by the legislation. And this is important because a lot of the media that focuses on gay and lesbian issues in the 1980s is primarily centered on the AIDS crisis, which understandably so given the devastating impact it had on the gay community. But the gay and lesbian community also had their lives impacted by other difficulties during that period, such as Section 28. And Blue Jean not only shines a light on the negative impact that Section 28 had, but it specifically focuses on lesbians and the lesbian community, something that's incredibly rare to see in cinema. In fact, so rare that this film is the first to do so. I mean, that is why I'm sat here yapping about it. So, Blue Jean is unique in that it not only portrays an important part of gay and lesbian history, but in that it also celebrates and focuses on lesbianism, taking care to show the sanctuary and joy that the lesbian community provided for each other during a time when wider society was hostile to their existence. And really, this film is a love letter to lesbians, as are all the other productions on this list in their own way, which is a perfect note to end this video on. Okay guys, thanks for watching, and an extra special thank you to my members on Ko-Fi for supporting this content and for supplying me with precious caffeine, which gives me the will to live for precisely 3 hours a day. If you know of any lesser known landmark lesbian films, be sure to put them down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more homosexual jest and merriment, or tears and regret. Stay tuned to find out which. Come! Join the fun. And I'll see you guys soon. Bye.